Hello everyone, welcome to the first lecture in our second unit of study for my Advanced American History class called the Reform Era, or otherwise known as the Progressive Era. So last unit we talked about the Industrial Revolution, and frankly we tended to focus on a lot of the positive aspects, how it improved people's lives, how it led to a rise in mass production and cheaper goods, and how society was changing, but not all of the impacts of industrialization were positive, and we did mention some of those: the rise of tenement housing in urban areas, the rise of xenophobia in areas in which a lot of immigrants were coming into. So today we are going to begin this look at an era that takes place really at the same time as our last unit. There's a lot of overlap, but we're going to basically, the way I like to summarize it is, we're going to look at how they try to solve the problems that were created by industrialization. So, therefore, reforming it and being progressive. So, our first look today, we are going to mainly take a look at what happened in that Reconstruction period. So, we're going to go back all the way to the Civil War and talk about, some of the changes that took place after slavery was abolished and how that obviously changed our country entirely and the impacts that it had. So, let's go ahead and dig into the notes. Let me get this pushed down there. All right, so the Reform Era. I always like to include a lot of pictures in these eras. This period of history, you're starting to get photography as a main medium, and you have some pretty amazing pictures that come out of this. I'm always shocked when I look at pictures like this, where you have a lot of kids who are working in coal mines or factories, whatever it may be. I remember being that age, being an elementary age kid. In relative parallel, I had a very, very good life, as I'm sure most people listening to this did. Odds are you were not being forced to go out and work in a coal mine at the age of 8. Okay, that was a big problem in this era. Child labor is going to be one of the big issues we talk about. The one reason we don't have to worry about those things today, at least in our country. And I do want to remind you that a lot of these lessons that we're learning can still be applied to today. The sad fact is child labor is still utilized in many countries throughout the world. So, we can work to, the progressive stances that we have pushed here in America. Those are things that frankly could be utilized elsewhere. So I think it's always good to set the bar high. But, especially when it comes to things like child labor, I would hope that, we could all agree that that's something that should be avoided. So let's look at how we started to fix some of these problems. Now, I did break this unit up into two different parts, okay? The first part, we're going to be examining some of the issues and problems that were created by industrialization, and the second part, we're going to look at how we attempted to solve those, some of which we did, like child labor, and others didn't as well. All right, but I want to begin by talking about this term, the Gilded Age, okay? This was a term coined by Mark Twain, and I've always loved Mark Twain as an author, just one of the most comedic writers that America's ever had. But he called this era the Gilded Age, and I want you to compare the pictures over on the right-hand side. So the bottom picture, you have those child laborers that we looked at on the first slide, but above them, you have the men that are basically putting them to work, right? These robber barons or captains of industry, these men that are becoming multi-billionaires, whereas the rest of society is tending to get poorer. Okay, so Mark Twain is saying this is the Gilded Age. Something that is gilded means that it's covered in gold. Now, is that the same thing as being gold? Well, of course not, right? Something that is simply covered in gold is not nearly as valuable. It's nice and shiny on the outside, much like the Industrial Revolution was. Look at all these fancy appliances that we're starting to use. Look at all the, things like cars. These are all wonderful inventions, but inside of it, it's rotten. Right? Inside of it, how are we getting these mass-produced clothing lines? Well, it's on the backs of things like child labor, right? So inside, it's actually rotten and corrupt and decrepit. So it looks bright and shiny and new on the outside, but inside, it's corrupt and resulting in a lot of negative things for the vast majority of society. So I think the Gilded Age is a great way to respond to this era. both bright and shiny, but a lot of problems when you really start to dig down deep. Now, we're going to take a break just from kind of the focus on the industrialization side, and I want to talk about the impact that Reconstruction had on this country. And again, we're starting to identify some of the problems that developed in the United States during this post-war period. The older I get, the more experience I have teaching, and the more I really dig into history, the more I find that this period of Reconstruction is one of the most impactful and frankly one of the saddest chapters in American history. We had such a bitter divide going into this era. I mean, literally the bitterest to the point where we were literally killing ourselves over these issues. And once the Civil War ended, we had a tremendous opportunity as a country to come together to end the evil institution of slavery and to try and push for a more equal society. That is not at all what happened. In fact, we just continued to push that division further. And frankly, what you're going to see is by the end of Reconstruction, for many African Americans, in some ways, they were actually in worse situations where they found themselves, many of which found themselves back on the very plantations that they had just been freed from, and economically tied to those, and sometimes legally still tied to those. So I'm getting ahead of myself here, but this period of Reconstruction is defined from the time 1865, the end of the Civil War, up to 1876. Now, we'll talk about the election that kind of ended Reconstruction, kind of the corrupt bargain that took place there. But, you know, the issues facing society at the time were daunting, right? You are moving not only to a completely new economic system, one from slave labor to now wage labor. That's not an easy transition. And beyond that, you have now 4 million former slaves that are frankly now unemployed. What do you do with all of them? Where do they find work? And this question remained, do you also, how much do you actually help give them a start? Do you just kind of push them out on the roadside and say, good luck? Or do you try to provide them with the ability, many of these former slaves were not educated. They have no money to their name. They have no shelter. All the basic human necessities required for, basic living have not been met. So how far does the government go in helping those 4 million former slaves actually get not a head start, but have just a basic level of basic needs met to where they can be functioning members of society? And sadly, I think what you're going to find out is that there was very little effort given to this. And so, this is really going to start explaining some of the economic and social divisions that, frankly, in some ways we continue to deal with all the way to today in 2020. It is all born right here. And so this is an extremely important and very painful chapter of our history. Let's take a look first at politics, though, okay? I want to look at what the political decisions were being made in the Reconstruction era. You had this new group that started to emerge after the Civil War, during the Civil War, really, but calling themselves the Radical Republicans. Now, I'm going to be referred to Republicans and Democrats quite a bit. We will cover this later on in some of our later units. I hope everyone understands that over the last century, the two parties have frankly really switched on a lot of major issues. So what you're going to see here is that some of the issues that these Republicans are pushing for, frankly, are not some of the same issues that Republicans today would be pushing for, and vice versa with the Democrats. So understand that while yes, these are the same parties in name, they are completely different political parties in terms of what their platform actually stands for, okay? A lot of switches took place in the 1960s with the Civil Rights era. That is really where you start to have some switching going on major platform ideas. But frankly, the Republicans want more government interaction in people's lives. That is not something that, small, limited government Republicans today would push for. So let's look at what the so-called radical Republican, and by the way, radical means that they wanted things like voting rights for black people. Again, today we would not refer to that as radical, just as a natural right. So the radical Republicans, they wanted civil voting rights for freed slaves and punishment of Confederates. They thought that these people that, in their minds started the war should be punished for their actions. I will note that Abraham Lincoln was not a radical Republican. He thought he was more of a moderate. Frankly, he wanted to kind of move past it. And we know this in the later years of his life. Of course, he's assassinated in 1865. So he's unable to push through a lot of the reforms that he wants to happen after the war. But he was not a radical. He did not desire to punish the Confederacy. In fact, he wanted to get back to normal as quickly as possible. But the radical Republicans do become the main voice in Congress in 1866, which allows them to pass a number of laws that, again, would not be passed under more moderate politicians, previously. Southerners were primarily Democrat at this time. Again, that's another thing that's switched, right? Now the South is almost always Republican, the solid South, but that has switched. And again, civil rights being the main issue. And frankly, at the time, that was the home. That was the emergence of what would become a terrorist group called the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK will emerge in the post-war South as a way to basically keep Southern society functioning in much the same way it was before the war. They will use terror tactics. They will use intimidation to keep African Americans from participating both politically and from even gathering socially. And ultimately, they will resort to violence and murder to make sure that the Southern way of life continues. So we will mention the KKK rising up and today, of course, they still exist. A number of hate groups have branched off from the KKK. So this is something that we will talk about throughout the rest of the year, honestly. Their popularity has waxed and waned over the years, but this is the emergence of that violent, racially motivated hate group known as the KKK. Now, also dealing with the political elements, we need to talk about the first ever impeachment of a president. Now, impeachment is an interesting topic, and we often apply that term incorrectly. Okay, impeachment requires a couple different things, or I should say, see, I just did it right there. Full removal via impeachment requires a number of different things happening, right? So you have to have a strong push from Congress. I believe the number is 2/3 of the Senate has to vote in order to actually remove a president, right? So the first step, though, is that the House of Representatives, okay, so you have a Congress, it's divided up, it's a bicameral, meaning two houses. So you have the House of Representatives, the larger portion of Congress. They are the ones to bring up charges, okay? And this has just happened over the last few years in America with President Trump, okay? The House brought up charges, in particular, due to some of the cover-up and things that were happening, resulting in the quid pro quo, offering benefits to Ukraine in exchange for certain information. That is what the House brought up impeachment charges for on President Trump, and they passed those. They voted that yes, there was that the president acted out of a respectful way that a president should act, that he violated the norms of what the presidency should be, and in some ways, broke with what represented what the presidency should do. The House has voted to impeach Trump, and at that point, it is technically right to say that President Trump was impeached, because he was impeached by the House. But he was not removed from office because the Senate did not have the votes to remove him. It takes 2/3. And that's a high number, and it should be a high number. We shouldn't be able to impeach and remove presidents too easily. Although this was heavily debated, even by the founding fathers writing the Constitution. So anyways, I tell you this about, what's happened recently with President Trump because, that's been more in the news. A very similar situation happens here in the 1860s with President Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson is pictured there in the bottom left. He took over as president after Lincoln was assassinated. Now, the radical Republicans absolutely despised Andrew Johnson. They did not like him at all. He was more of a moderate, and they just didn't think he went too far. He was actually a Southerner. So a lot of these Republicans Republicans are saying that, he is more than willing to help kind of get Southerners back in the fold. And so they actually found, I won't say a loophole, because he did, in fact, violate this law, but there had been a very recent law passed called the Tenure of Office Act, which required that before the president could fire any official, he had to basically get the okay from Congress. Well, Johnson didn't do that. I believe it was Edwin Stanton that Johnson fired. But he fired them without checking with Congress, and in that manner violated that new recent law. Well, Congress called him out on that, and the House did vote to impeach him. He was officially impeached by the House. When it went to the Senate to vote to remove him or not, Johnson was able to keep his job by one vote. One vote. That's how close it was. We only almost had the first removal. And it was, again, this was a lot of political pressure, a lot of political reasons. Just because a president even violates the law does not mean that they have to be impeached. It is left up to Congress to decide whether it is an impeachable offense and an offense worthy of removal. So, again, we do have some parallels with what's happened with President Trump being impeached by the House last year. Johnson decides not to run again. I can't blame him. He knows that he's not quite very popular, and in particular, there's been a new politician rise up, a man who is already a household name, and that is the Republican candidate Ulysses S. Grant. Now, he was the war hero. He was the hero of the Civil War, leading the Union Army. So, again, he had a lot of support, and he did lean towards the radical Republican side. So, a lot of radical Republicans supported Grant. Ultimately, we've actually already mentioned Grant, our last unit, that Credit Mobilier scandal, that happened under Grant. In fact, Grant's whole tenure as president would be riddled with corruption scandals, and some of which he may have known about, but a lot of it was because of other officials in the White House. But that sadly becomes known, Grant kind of becomes known as this president constantly putting out corruption fires, and was not a very positive tenure as president. Now, the radical Republicans are able to get some amendments passed to the Constitution. This does not happen too often, okay? Remember, 1789 was when the Constitution was written. So what that means is in, what would that be, 11, that'd be 76 years. In 76 years, there have only been 13 amendments passed, okay? And considering that the first 10 happened immediately after in 1791 with the Bill of Rights, what that really means is now we're looking at 74 years. In 74 years, we have only had 3 amendments, okay? This doesn't happen too often, right? Amendments, and it shouldn't happen too often. The Constitution should not be changed based off of whims or kind of the political hot topics of the day. The Constitution needs to remain the framework of the government and be the most essential information guiding on what that government can and cannot do. But these are important amendments, and they needed to be passed. And today, in particular, the 14th Amendment is something with due process and equal protection that we continue to lean on quite heavily today. So very, very important to all Americans, regardless of race. So the very first one that is passed in 1865 is the 13th Amendment. This made slavery illegal. Most people think that slavery just became illegal at the end of the Civil War. That's actually incorrect. Okay, there had to be a specific amendment that ended slavery. Getting into a little more detail than you probably want, slavery was actually still legal at the end of the war, even in places like Missouri. Okay, Missouri was a border state, and since they did not officially, and this is still debatable, since they did not officially go for the side of the Confederacy, they were allowed to remain a slave state up until this point that this 13th Amendment was passed. So it was necessary to get every state on board to pass this amendment. So you do need to know these Civil War amendments, what they stood for, and that is something that will be on your test. So 13th made slavery illegal. The 14th Amendment, passed a few years later, this did extend citizenship to people of all races, except for Native Americans. Native Americans are seen, frankly, as a foreign peoples that are located within our land. And so there are there's a system of reservations, even by this point, in which they've continually, of course, been pushed out of the eastern territories, and that land would continue to dwindle all the way to the point where they really just kind of have Oklahoma, and then that gets taken away from them. So, again, getting ahead of myself here, but this amendment does extend the citizenship to all people of all races. Major items here: due process and equal protection. Due process means that you have to, every person deserves to have the same process followed to protect their rights. So, for instance, if you get pulled over and arrested for something, you have the certain protections in place. Should be extended due process. They cannot arrest you and then hold you for 100 days without charging you with a crime. Okay, there's a process that needs to take place, and it needs to be speedy for every person. That they need to be granted a trial by a jury of their peers, if they if the crime permits it. So these things are very important protections for all of us, regardless of race. Equal protection. This is important because, regardless of skin color, the law should protect us equally. Right? That has not always happened, and this is something that we still have issues today. That there's a lot of institutional and systematic racism that is inherent, and this is one that is constantly utilized in trying to defeat those unequal laws that still exist. Moving on to the 15th Amendment. This deals with the right to vote for males, okay? Women, you're going to have to wait another 50 years, okay? Women are not going to be allowed to vote until 1920. It gets rolling in 1919, but it does not take effect till 1920. But the 15th Amendment says that the right to vote, quote, shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Just because you were a slave when you were born does not mean that you were ineligible to vote afterwards. This is a major milestone in making our society a more democratic one, okay? Having more people with a say. It is not a perfect amendment, and it would need to be revised. As the country has progressed over the last few centuries, we have added to the role on who could vote. Originally, it was just white male landowners, and thankfully, we've gotten away from that and had a more democratic society as a result. But this 15th Amendment allowed African American males, that was who it was primarily designed for, the ability to vote, okay, the right to vote. Now, it allows them to. Now, the reality was in the South that there was often a lot of hurdles that had to be jumped. Number one, if you were a black man in the South and attempted to vote, you can expect a few things. Number one, when you arrive at the polls, you would often be given a test, okay, a literacy test that you would have to pass. And frankly, it was left up to the election official to decide whether you passed it or not. So even if you stumbled over a word, they may say, sorry, you didn't pass. You would also be subject to a poll tax. So if you are a poor person, good luck voting. If you already struggle to put food on the table, why are you going to waste money on a vote? And then also the intimidation factor. African Americans were not participating, in particular in the South, because at this time it was not even a secret ballot. Okay, you actually would voice your vote verbally, and so. It was well known who was voting for what, and for African Americans, they often found the fact that they were intimidated from voting. They were intimidated to not vote. With threats made against them, their families, if they did have their voices concerned. So, this system that's going to put in place, we have laws in place. All three of these are excellent laws. They're good things for America. But were they actually followed? Not in every case, okay? Not in every case. That 15th Amendment is going to be key. Excuse me. We'll fast forward all the way to the Civil Rights era, and frankly, 90% of African Americans in the South were not voting. And a big reason was because of that intimidation factor. Also things like the grandfather clause that we'll talk about later on. So just because in law it says that legally you have the right to vote, that does not necessarily mean that people were able to vote. So that is going to be one of the big problems that develops over the next few decades. Now let's shift away from politics and talk a little bit about economics, okay, the money, and focus on how people are making ends meet. Now, after the Civil War, there was a government agency formed called the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the government created this agency, and as I began the lecture, I mentioned, how do you take these 4 million people who have been slaves, and how do you, provide them with basic necessities for life, for living? I'm talking food, shelter, okay? They're all unemployed. Most have no education. They have no money. What do you do? There has to be a basic level of aid that is supplied to these people to get them on their feet. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created in order to help with that. It not only built things like schools, but also was in some ways, they tried to find jobs for former slaves. These are all positive things. As you can imagine, this was not necessarily a popular program throughout the country. And in particular, in the South, the Freedmen's Bureau would often find themselves with their newly built schools burnt down. They found pressure. Eventually, politicians began defunding the Freedmen's Bureau. If you can't just defeat them, you might as well defund them. By 1870, they have lost most of their funding. The government is no longer willing to fund this agency. Now, we have just gotten done with 300 years, roughly, of I guess less than that, 1609, 1619. We're looking at 250 plus years of slavery, and they have defunded the main agency that was responsible for aiding these former slaves after 5 years. Okay? A lot of time in slavery, little time to help the people that escaped slavery. A lot of this, as I said, was because of pressure and intimidation from Southern Democrats at the time. Weakened by KKK violence. You can build a school, but what happens if they burn it down? What happens if the KKK shows up and blocks your students from leaving the door? As a father, would you really want to risk? Would I really want to risk my children walking to school knowing that the KKK may be out there? That would perhaps even kill them just for attending school. So I hope you understand that there's a lot of intimidation. Extra-legal intimidation that's happening here. By 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau is completely gone, and basically they say, former slaves, good luck, figure it out. This is laying the groundwork for, frankly, vastly impoverished African-American population, primarily in the South, and that will not get better for a very long time. In fact, I think you could very well argue over the last 50 years is really when we've started to see, some improvement. This is one of the biggest failures, frankly, in American history. And, I'm not here to hate on America. I think, we have, throughout our nation from the very beginning, I think, has been a country that, at least in name and principle, has pushed out a lot of positive things. But we have to examine these kind of moments where we have failed people. And this is one that I continue to come back to, and I can't imagine what it must have been like for those freed slaves to have absolutely no help, no prospects. Where do you go? What do you do? They had no idea, and frankly, many of them would starve to death and basically accept any kind of work for any kind of pay that they could. Now, some Northerners were not helping the situation. We often look at the Civil War and we say, oh, the North was the good guy, South was the bad guy. Again, you cannot take complex issues like that in history and simplify them that much. You did have a lot of Northerners coming down that were taking advantage, exploiting the monetary situation in the South. They were called carpetbaggers. They would often arrive with, just what they call a carpet bag, with some of their funds and, clothing, things like that. And then they would basically buy up, plantations for pennies on the dollar, and these Northerners were known to be taking advantage of the fact that the Southern economy is completely destroyed. So you could buy up acreage that even the previous year, before the wars started, may have in today's money cost millions of dollars, and maybe today you're paying hundreds of dollars for that. So this sparks a lot of anger, resentment in the South towards Northerners who are taking advantage of it. There are also a lot of social issues that are happening, and I've mentioned a couple of these already. So even though we have the passage of the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection under the law, that begins to be violated pretty much right away. In particular in the South, it has always been Southerners' biggest fear that there would be kind of this uprising of African Americans, and there was this desire to keep them in their place, and if they could not do that, legally, they would do that through other ways. And we talked about the rise of the KKK. But there were some states that began passing laws which tried to keep African Americans in a condition similar to slavery. It allowed for things like annual labor contracts, okay? And I'll mention that here soon with sharecropping. But these series of what were called black codes, and eventually this would devolve into segregation as well, to where restaurants would be able to say, this is a white-only restaurant. Blacks are not allowed to be served in there. And you might be saying, well, what about the 14th Amendment, equal protection? Well, we're going to see that in 1892 there was a law passed, or a Supreme Court case that is decided, that allows for states to pass these kind of laws legally. So once again, a major failure, the late 1800s, a major failure in U.S. politics that allowed, really set us back by in some counts, 50 plus years. As I said, the KKK will rise up during this time. Violent Southern opposition group formed in response. There's a lot of things that the KKK was against. Excuse me. Terrorized blacks in the South. And I do not use the word terrorism lightly. Okay, but they did terrorize people. They used intimidation to basically keep people from becoming politically active. This is the least democratic thing that we could have. The KKK has taken on different forms over the years. This early period, it was mainly veterans of the Confederate Army that were often, in fact, the first uniforms of the KKK, they would dress up in their old Confederate outfits, put a sheet on their head, and basically try to scare and intimidate. Eventually, this is going to turn violent, and you're going to have lynchings throughout the South, kind of mob violence in which they would, hang African Americans in particular, really anybody that, pushed against these norms that had been in the South for a very long time. So the KKK was formed to try and keep that Southern way of life intact. And the only way they could do that was through intimidation and violence. Later on, the KKK that is revived in the 1920s is a little bit different. This KKK is very anti-black. Okay, that's kind of the main thing. It is all about race. The KKK that develops in the 1920s and later on is an all-encompassing hate group, and they are formed kind of in response to immigration that's taken place. So anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-immigrant, instead of just anti-black. So how does Reconstruction come to an end? I always have to give a pathetic, just, this is such a failure by politicians of this era. Again, you have 300 years of slavery, right? And they think that they're going to solve all the issues that has created in basically 10 years. An immense failure of American politics. But 1877, I think my original slide said 1876. 1877 is really the end of Reconstruction, where you have a compromise candidate elected, and his name was Rutherford B. Hayes. He made it well known before the election took place that if he was elected, that he would remove federal troops and would restore home rule. Up to this point, the Union Army, the American Army at this point, has had troops occupying different states. So he promises the removal of those troops. And I don't think I mentioned it, but that Freedmen's Bureau we talked about earlier, that was run by the United States Army. Okay, so, the South was still occupied at this time. And, they wanted those troops gone. So this was even though the South was primarily Democrat, Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican they were willing to vote for because, They wanted those troops gone. They wanted the South to have, their rights respected in their eyes. He promised, as it says there, as long as states respected the rights of freedmen, so these former slaves, and surprise, they didn't. Of course not. We're going to see even more violent and in particular anti-black laws coming out of, in particular, the South over the next few decades. The reality is the war's been over for 12 years. Northerners are frankly tired of this. Okay, and frankly, they, I think we simplify this era too often by saying the North was the good guys, the South was the bad guys, and that's it. That was not the case. Frankly, both sides were racist, and I think that's a hard pill to swallow for some of us, but we have to look at, even what these guys were saying in public. Both sides resented African Americans becoming more active in their societies. And so the North was not only tired of spending resources on the South, but they were also, frankly, more sympathetic, I think, to what the Southern politicians wanted. They were tired of trying to push for all of these issues of black rights, and basically kind of gave up. And so tremendous opportunity to push for a more equal society, a more equal democracy, and we failed. We failed those people. Black codes become increasingly harsh and institutionalized. We will talk later on about how segregation becomes the norm in society, and even though they believe that these are being utilized to keep social order, really they're being utilized to keep African Americans down. They are not being allowed to vote. They are not being allowed to really become productive members of society in mass. And that is the reality of the situation. So again, a very, I can't remember if that's it, sharecropping and tenant farming. This will become the norm for many African Americans. The sad fact is that those African Americans who were freed by the end of the war, many of them found themselves back at the exact same plantations that they had been born at, and frankly would remain the remainder of their lives. Sharecropping is when you basically hire farmers to live on the land. You provide them things like a house, a shelter. You provide them the tools needed to farm the land, and in exchange, they do the farming, and frankly, they owe rent. They owe for those tools. Now, this is going to not only wrap up these former slaves and these African Americans, but also many poor whites also get wrapped up in it. We're going to read a book in the springtime called The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, and it's about a white family from Oklahoma that are sharecroppers, and they're basically getting kicked off their land by the bank because they can't afford to stay there. So a lot, the sharecropping, frankly, and I think it says it on the next one. One thing you're going to hear about sharecropping a lot is that last line there, that this was slavery by a different name. Okay, slavery by a different name. For many African Americans, they are going back to the exact same cotton fields that they had just been released from because they have no other option. Okay? They don't have the ability to pick up and to move across the country to a different state. They are stuck. They are stuck there. And so many of them do sign annual labor contracts, which force them to live on the plantations to continue work. And, they have to often pay for the uses. So, yes, they may make wages. You may make, $1 a week, but, ultimately what happens is your rent for your house and for your tools and for the seed, maybe 90 cents or maybe even more than that. And so what starts happening is that these people who are working end up creating debts. Okay, they end up signing these contracts that are out of their favor, and basically, even though you are getting paid now, you have to turn around and pay a lot of that back just for the right to work there. And so these people end up getting deeply in debt. And once you're in debt, you can't leave. Okay, so now you're tied to the land because you owe that owner a certain amount of money. It's just a terrible, terrible situation. And like I said, this did wrap up. It was not just blacks. It was also whites as well that got wrapped up in this. And we'll see this continue on for quite a while. I think that does it. Yes, there we go. So I think that does it for the first section here. So I hope you understand that although there were a lot of positive things, at least in name, that were passed after the Civil War, Reconstruction overall was an immense failure. And you want to look at even a lot of the issues that are still happening today about income inequality, political, people that are disenfranchised politically. You will find the roots of it right here in this period of time. And I do consider this the biggest failure in American history. The ability to bring these recently freed people into a situation in which they could be equal politically, socially, economically. We denied them that right, and we are still suffering from those sins today. It's a tough unit to talk about, a way to begin this, but we have to understand this if we want to correct the problems of today. We have to understand where these problems came from. Guys, thank you so much for listening, and as always, email me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer those. Thanks.